Well, good morning. I hope you can all hear us. Good, good. It's wonderful to see you all here so early, and I hope you were all very careful not to make any noise out on the quad, because our students were partying very late at the library last night, and we wouldn't want to wake them up because I know that they won't be up for hours. But by the time we're in full swing here, they should be starting to move around out there. We're here this morning to celebrate winning women at Duke. And it's my pleasure to introduce one of the winningest women I know. So we've asked Judy Woodruff to say a few words to us this morning about her experiences at Duke back in the day, by which I mean the 1960s, which was probably the high water mark of women's college. Judy was a women's college graduate, and so we've asked her to kind of focus on that, her experiences at women's college. And she'll speak for a bit, and then we'll save some time for your questions and comments. I'm going to tell you more about Judy in a minute, but first I thought it would be fitting, since we're here to commemorate women's college, to just briefly kind of review the history of that organization, which Women's College existed for a fleeting moment in the history of Duke from 1930 to 1972. The history of Women's College was laid out for its incoming class in 1941 in this nifty little handbook, which some of you may have had. I'm sure this was used for many years. This is class of 1940-41, actually. The handbook points out that since the days of Brown's Schoolhouse, and you all remember that Brown's Schoolhouse was Duke's progenitor, the log cabin out in Randolph County where Duke got its start, since the days of Brown's Schoolhouse, women have studied at Duke University. And until the 1840s, this is the 1840s we're talking about here, women were admitted on an equal basis with men to Brown's Schoolhouse. And there was even a female faculty member in the mid-19th century at Brown's Schoolhouse, or the Union Institute as it was later known, later became Trinity College. She was a woman named Miss Irene Leach, and she was a faculty member for a while and later ended up married to the president. Her thoughts on this are not recorded. I thought that was an interesting fact. So after the 1840s, for some reason, it was decided that women could not be admitted on an equal basis with men, and so they were allowed to have private instruction with faculty members, but not to matriculate. During the Civil War, they were again admitted for reasons we can guess at. At the close of the Civil War, when the boys came home, of course, the women were again excluded. So in 1874, three famous sisters applied to Duke. The Giles sisters, Mary, Teresa, and Persis. So this little handbook, and there's a wonderful history in here, it describes them as perhaps the first women who ever dared to aspire to a full college course in a North Carolina college. They were not admitted. Like their predecessors, they were encouraged to study privately, independently with faculty members, and they did so for 3 years, and they took the exams with the other students. So by this time, Braxton Craven was the president. You've heard of Braxton Craven, for whom our Braxton Craven Society is named, visionary. President Craven taught most of the senior class, and he encouraged the Giles sisters to participate in the class with the men, to take the exams. And indeed, the Giles sisters, although they never matriculated, were able to graduate in 1878. So after the Giles sisters, though, for some reason, no women enrolled for a long time. In 1892, Trinity College moved from Randolph County to the cosmopolitan Durham, North Carolina. And at that point, the admission of women became a more pressing question. You know, these were urban girls. They weren't going to fool around here. So they wanted to be in college. And in 1896, Washington Duke settled the question of women's admissions by giving the college $100,000 as a permanent endowment fund, conditioned on admitting women to Trinity College on an equal footing with men. And since 1896, every graduating class at Trinity and Duke has had women in it. But there was still a problem. What are you going to do with all these girls? It was really hard to find appropriate housing, or so it was thought. And the problem got more difficult when, again, the boys came home from World War I. Special dormitories were built for the increasing numbers, and then James B. Duke created the indenture that formed Duke University in the middle 20s. And the Trinity campus was enlarged and renovated for the women, and a coordinated women's college seemed like a great idea. Trinity College was relocated to the new Gothic campus 1.5 miles away. I've always wondered whether real estate practicalities more than any pedagogical theory was behind the formation of Women's College. In any event, Dr. Alice M. Baldwin, a professor of history, became the first dean of Women's College, and in greeting the class of 1940-41, in this little handbook, her lovely greeting, she told the girls that many opportunities for happiness lie before you. No doors will be closed to you unless by yourselves. I hope that many will swing wide and that you will walk through them into rich experiences of mind and heart and spirit. I just think that's a lovely sentiment, you know, not you'll lead a Fortune 500 corporation, you will have rich experiences of mind and heart and spirit. Well, we have with us this morning a girl for whom many doors have swung open, and perhaps she'll talk a little bit about how much of a push those doors needed. Judy Woodruff is a 1968 graduate of Women's College. She is the recipient of an honorary degree from Duke in 1998. She's a trustee emerita. And for several years, she taught a weekly seminar here at the Sanford School on media and politics. She's currently senior correspondent and a frequent anchor of Public Broadcasting System's renowned NewsHour. She's one of the leading, and I would say the leading, woman in broadcast news, and that's a field that the women of her generation really pioneered. As a political analyst, she exemplifies wisdom, experience, and civility in a field that needs all three qualities more than it knows. So Judy has covered politics and other news for more than 3 decades at CNN, NBC, PBS. She began her career covering Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign in 1975, served as chief White House correspondent for NBC from 1977 to 82, chief Washington correspondent for PBS's MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, 1984 to 90, and anchored PBS's award-winning weekly documentary series Frontline with Judy Woodruff. She's done it all. She's made documentaries of her own, including one in 2011, Nancy Reagan, The Role of a Lifetime, and in 2006, a PBS documentary entitled Generation Next, about the thoughts and values of young people in America. She is the founding co-chair of the International Women's Media Foundation, an organization dedicated to promoting and encouraging women in the communications industry around the world. She's the recipient of the Cine Lifetime Achievement Award, a Duke Distinguished Alumni Award, the Edward R. Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Broadcast Journalism and Television, the University of Southern California Walter Cronkite Award for Excellence in Journalism, and many others. These are extraordinary honors for an extraordinary person. Judy also serves as a member of the Knight Foundation Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics and the boards of the National Museum of American History, the Newseum, the Freedom Forum, and the Urban Institute. In her spare time, for those of you who worry about work-life balance, Judy's married to a man who has a pretty demanding journalism career of his own, and she has 3 children. So this is a life that is rich in experiences of heart and mind and spirit. We're honored to have you with us this morning, Judy Woodruff.
Thank you. Thank you, Cindy, very much. Thank you, Cindy Brodhead, and thank you for all that you do for Duke University. You have been such an important part of the life of this place since you and Dick came, including immersing yourself in projects like this one. I don't know who it was who said it, but it was absolutely right. The hardest job at a university is not the president, but the spouse of the president. And I have to say, I noticed when you told the Chronicle a few years ago, they gave you one of those long Q&As, which, and one of the questions was, who is the historical figure with whom you most identify? And Cindy said, Abigail Adams. I love that. Good pick. I love the theme of this weekend, winning women advocates, educators, and athletes. I am so sorry I missed yesterday's program. It sounds as if from the reports I've gotten, it was clearly outstanding. It is so good to see all of you here. I've already seen so many friends, and I'm going to catch up with every one of you before the day is out. I can't believe you got up so early. I feel heavy pressure to keep this interesting. I want to say too, Cindy, I am so pleased that Duke set aside this weekend every year. I guess you've done it for the last few years to recognize women alums, to talk about issues on the minds of women alums. You know, it brought to mind, you know, it's one of those occasions when we sort of measure how women are doing, and I was reminded of she was a Canadian writer, Charlotte Whitten, and she said, I love this line, she said, whatever women do, they must do twice as well as men to be thought half as good. Luckily, this is not difficult. Because as all of us know, there's been a sentiment, you know, in some places, you know, say, oh, we've done enough recognizing women, singling them out, celebrating them. They've come so far, we don't need to be thinking about women separately. I don't agree with that. I think there's always going to be a time and a place, certainly in my lifetime, to reflect on how women are doing. Yes, we've come a long way, but when you consider how few women there are still in positions of power in this country, we have to stop, I think, and take stock every so often, and that's why I think gatherings like this one are so important. You know, it wasn't until later, by the way, while we're talking about taking stock, I realized this much later, but during my 4 years in college, from 1964 to 68, the number of women serving in Congress in the House of Representatives dropped from 12 to 11, and the number of women in the U.S. Senate dropped from 2 to 1. You know, Congress is just one measure, but it's a reminder of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. It's only 17% today. I just want to say as a preface that my women's college experience was so long ago, I've forgotten a lot of it, so I'm going to make a few things up here. That's the bad part. The good thing you should know is that I don't know where the actual memories end and the made-up part begins, so it's not intentional fabrication. But in all seriousness, just having this assignment from Cindy set off this serious, intense round of reflecting, thinking back to my 2 years at Duke. I was a transfer student, comparing it to my life pre-Duke, after Duke. Only half as long I was here as the typical Duke undergraduate back then. So I reached out to a few classmates, friends I'm still in touch with. At least one of you is here. I just saw Louise Dunlap back there, an amazing woman who lives in Washington, somebody I admired so much and who shared some of her thoughts from the Brown House experience. But doing this turned out to be such a valuable exercise because it not only helped fill out the picture of my women's college experience, it helped put it in a context in ways that I think may be a little more useful this morning. But it got our little group from the class of '68 reminiscing, and we plan to continue and keep that up. What is so hard, I think, to comprehend today as we look back more than 4 decades is the extent to which we were coming of age, figuring out who we were, what we wanted to do with our lives, at a time when not 1, not 2, but 3 massive social movements were exploding around us, any one of which would have had profound implications for the future of the United States and for us personally. The country was literally coming awake after the sleepy 1950s. The 60s, of course, was the decade of women's rights. It was a decade of civil rights for African Americans and growing public opposition, of course, to the Vietnam War. To one degree or another, whether we embraced those causes or not at that moment in our lives, we were surrounded by them, and our lives would take a different course as a result. Having said that, And while I was profoundly affected by the largest events, my school years were bookended by the assassinations of John F. Kennedy at one end, my senior year in high school, and Robert Kennedy, and of course Martin Luther King, my senior year at Duke. Even so, I know in retrospect, even with that, I know in retrospect, I was sheltered growing up because I had spent the latter part of my junior high and high school years living in Augusta, Georgia. I was sheltered from a great deal of what was happening. And I just want to give you a bit of personal background before I talk about Duke. I grew up moving around the world. I was an Army brat, the daughter of a career Army father, a homemaker mother who made family her priority. She grew up poor in the Depression, never finished high school, gave up driving a car after she drove it through the garage, and was quite dependent on my father. Despite that, she always urged me to get the best education I could, to study hard, and to have a career that would allow me to support myself. As much as I loved her, I watched her closely, and starting at a young age, I knew that I wanted something different. She was and is, at age 88, a saint. To meet her, you would think she's quiet and meek, but she's actually an incredibly strong woman. And she was a huge and is a huge influence on me. My grandmothers were also very strong women. Neither had a great deal of formal education, but they were forces to be reckoned with, dominant figures in their families. The other women who played early formative roles in my life were, you won't be surprised to know, my teachers, starting in junior high, high school in Augusta, Georgia, where the Army had transferred my father. The majority of them were women, and almost all, you know the term spinsters. They were smart, they were formidable, and they were single women who gave their lives to teaching to their students, to setting the best example they could, to getting us excited and engaged about learning and preparing us for life. That continued after high school, less than 25 miles from here, because I started at Meredith College in Raleigh, a wonderful four-year women's institution. It offered me a scholarship that, along with 2 jobs in the dining hall and working the switchboard, made it possible for me to go there. That was a life-changing experience. It brought a lot of impressive young women together, most of them from the southeastern United States. It gave us a chance to excel. I dove into my 2 years there. I thrived. I studied hard. I had several deeply influential and memorable women professors at Meredith. That time helped give me the confidence that I had not really had coming out of high school, this large public high school in Augusta, where so many students were not headed for college. I was elected sophomore class president at Meredith. I made many dear friends there. I learned a lot from books. I learned a lot about life. And throughout, I had in the back of my mind, I wanted to transfer to Duke. As it turned out, one of my freshman year instructors at Meredith was a woman who not only turned me on to political science, I changed my major because of her. She agreed with this idea of transferring to Duke. Carolyn Murray Happer had herself gone to Duke. She encouraged me. She became a significant positive influence in my life. And of course, our lives have intersected ever since, but just not often enough. And I see her sitting right there. Good morning, Dr. Happer. I was accepted at Duke. I managed to triple the size of my college loan. I landed a job working in the admissions office. I was moved up from the switchboard. I transferred in the fall of 1966. I moved into ACOC, right next door. I didn't initially pay a lot of attention to the significance of this all-women's campus because I had just come from an all-women's college. But I, of course, soon heard rumblings of complaints from classmates who didn't like the dress code. We had to wear skirts and dresses to class. Chafed under strict curfews, rules about where we could go on and off campus, felt some constraint by the separation of the genders. And, you know, some of those complaints were successful. The rules eventually started to fall. 4 years, as Cindy just said, 4 years after I graduated, the women's college ceased to be. But I love the all-women's dorm experience, that feeling of having a home base on this big campus, a place where you could go, where a few people at least knew you and wanted to talk to you and recognized your face and knew your name. I was very lucky to have a dozen or so friends who've remained in touch ever since. One of them, Paula Phillips, who also lived in Aycock, our own beloved Paula Berger, who I think is away at a trustee meeting right now. But I know she's going to be joining us later today. She was an important intellectual and personal influence in my life. Paula told me the other day, she said it was unheard of back then for anybody to move to another dorm. She talked about the character that each dorm took on. And she said, for example, can you imagine a group calling itself the Basset Hounds? But the classmates I surveyed, all of whom, unlike me, came to Duke as freshmen, talked about the FACs, the Freshman Advisory Councils, as being enormously valuable, creating a core group of friends. They immediately sort of stabilized this strange new home away from home, gave them an early exposure to upper-class women who, as leaders, would become role models for so many of them. In fact, I think the most important thing that happened to me at Duke, aside from the fantastic education I got here, taking mostly political science and history courses, and by the way, sadly, no women professors at all during my 2 years, something I assume was the case at most of the nation's co-ed universities at that time. Notwithstanding, I would say the most important thing for me was the impression strong women on this campus had on me. They didn't all look alike, they didn't all dress alike. Everywhere I looked, though, there were smart, self-confident women in the Women's College administration, for example. Mary Grace Wilson, the dean, she set an example befitting her name. She made sure that Duke women were on our toes. She represented the school well. We represented the school well, no matter where we went. Among the students, there were scores, there were hundreds of women who studied hard, who talked about books, who talked about going to graduate school, about careers, many of whom held their own with their professors. They didn't sit meekly and wait for the guys to do all the talking. They were raising their hands and they were talking too. In many ways, it was as if in the span of the 2 short years since I had left high school, I had been transported to another planet where women didn't make marriage right away their top priority. That would come later, in my case, much later. But a place where women comfortably held positions of leadership. There was a women's college senior, a woman named Mary Earle from Greensboro, who was charismatic, articulate. She was the head of women's student government. I think a lot of women back then looked up to her and to women like her. She was a year ahead of us. I was pleased to note, by the way, Cindy, that Duke honored Mary, I think a year or two ago, as one of the unsung heroines of Duke, recalling her student activism, speaking out about the civil rights movement, the students' rights movement, Vietnam, and so forth. And I think it's interesting to note that she was head of women's student government. The next year after she graduated, my senior year, was the year we combined the student government. It was ASDU, I love the acronym, Associated Students of Duke University. And a man was elected president of student government. So one step forward and one step back, in a sense. We're going to talk about activism in the panel that follows this, but I just want to say for now that I do wonder for all the agitating women did to combine women's and men's housing and women's and men's student government about what we gave up in that major decision at the time that seemed so right when it was done, and yet there were consequences. And I know we want to talk a little bit about that. In a co-ed atmosphere, some women did lose a little chutzpah, even strong Southern women who had been raised to speak their mind. There was a great deal of pressure on women then to conform. Sure, you could be smart, but you weren't supposed to knock people over by being too assertive. I'm reminded of what Marlo Thomas, the actress, said, I think it was about 20 years ago. Somebody asked her about how outspoken she had been in her career, and she said, a man has to be Joe McCarthy in order to be called ruthless. All a woman has to do is put you on hold. And And of course, there was the expected focus on men and social life, but Duke, through the Women's College, was so much more than that. It was a place that made it easier for me to imagine a career, a life of purpose. First, I thought about working in politics and government, then it was journalism. I interned in Washington while I was at Duke for my congressman from Georgia for 2 summers. The second summer, I roomed with women from Duke, which was an incredible experience for me. Every one of them was headed on to graduate school or to a serious career. 2 quick vignettes before I'm quiet and we can have more of a dialogue, a conversation here, just to give you a flavor of the times and how they affected me. In my senior year, by which time Duke had admitted a handful of African American students. I think 1963 was the first year as an undergraduate. African American students were admitted. But we learned that my sorority's national office had declared that it would not accept blacks as members. I was so upset about this and so angry, along with a number of other women, that I thought very seriously about resigning. I didn't. At least one of the younger members of the sorority did. I ultimately did not. Part of it was out of loyalty to my big sister in the sorority. She was the president that year. I was persuaded, after a lot of conversations with different people, that it made more sense to try to change the system from within. I stayed a member, but to my regret, I never really followed up on that promise to myself. The second thing I would mention, in the spring of my senior year, when student activism around Vietnam was really just starting to make itself evident, but not yet in really big ways around here, and in the immediate aftermath, this was, of the King assassination. A group of students came together, many of them students against the war, but they took on the cause of the food workers here at Duke, non-academic employees who were not unionized, were lobbying for a raise. Over the course of about a week, or maybe it was longer than that, they staged a silent vigil on the West Campus quad. I know all of you from that era remember. And after a day or so of wrestling with myself, I joined them out on the quad, hardly believing that I was actually doing this. The vigil did go on to persuade Duke trustees to agree to a pay raise, to give these employees greater say in their working conditions. You know, it sounds like a small thing for me. Yes, you sat out on the quad on a few beautiful spring days. But it did, in a small way, stir something inside of me. It gave me some appreciation for what it means to put yourself out there. Something that, you know, in the past, I think I thought of myself as an observer who was comfortable sort of staying back and looking. And this, I crossed a line when that happened. So even though it looked like a small thing on the outside, for me, it was significant. Of course, when I decided later to go into journalism, I reverted to the observer role for pretty much the rest of my life. But I guess you can say I've been an active observer. Still, that was probably the last time I publicly took sides on a political issue. So I look back on it with special fondness and have appreciated, you know, reminiscing about that, and hope we can talk about that and some other things now. There's more I could talk about this morning, and I hope we'll get into about the war and Greek life and non-Greek life and so forth. But mainly, Cindy, I just give Duke credit for exposing me to the great debates of the time, to incredible women. I could have done more, I think, in retrospect, than dip my toe in. I could have been more of an activist. That's not the path that I chose on campus. But my life was so enriched by the time that I spent here. And that's why this college was so important to me. For 2 short but important years in my life, I was exposed to the best and the brightest. It lifted my sights. It made it easier for me to envision the career that I eventually chose. My professors had a lot to do with that, but so did the women at Duke, whose paths I was so fortunate to cross. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I hope we can have a conversation.
Thank you, Judy. That's all really fascinating. And you and I are pretty much contemporaries in terms of living through the 60s and the time of turmoil that you describe and the kinds of experiences that you had while you were here on campus. And you've spoken a little bit about this, but I'm wondering whether, you know, I made reference to the fact that although you are a journalist, the particular aspect of journalism that you've chosen and really invented didn't really exist before your generation of women. And so I'm very intrigued to know how a political science major from Duke became one of the first and one of the leading women broadcast. I mean, there weren't women in TV news. I mean, there were weather girls when you and I were coming up. There were weather girls, but
there was a woman named Pauline Frederick who covered the United Nations. I think for NBC.
She escaped my notice.
She was the only one for a long time.
So how did Duke help you envision, or did Duke? Let me put that in the form of a question, as they say on Jeopardy. Did Duke help you imagine that women could do this, or that you could do this, and how might that have come about? Because there really was nobody, except for Pauline Joseph, doing it.
Right. Well, it's, I'd love to tell you that there was some grand scheme and strategy in all of this, but it's a fairly prosaic kind of, course of events. Carolyn Happer had a lot to do with it. My decision, I will tell you what happened to me at Meredith is my freshman year, I had gone to Meredith thinking I was going to major in math because I didn't know what I was going to do there. As I said, there hadn't been many women role models in my life. I knew I didn't think I would be a good teacher, and so teaching I had set aside. And I thought, well, what else? And somebody said, well, do you ever think about math? And I had done well in the math SATs, and I thought, okay, I'll try math. So my freshman instructor in calculus at Meredith was a grad student from North Carolina State who thought women basically should not be taking advanced math. So it was a pretty discouraging experience. So for all of you who today talk about STEM and the importance of science and math in educating women, I'm a living example of how I went in the other direction. But thank goodness for me, at the same time, I had another big influence in my life. I was falling in love with political science, politics, at the same time I was falling out of love with math. And who knows what would have happened. But Carolyn Happer had a lot to do with it. I fell in love with it. I had already had an inkling about it because the first summer after college, I worked in the county treasurer's office in the delinquent tax division in Richmond County, Georgia. There was just something about government that appealed to me. I cannot explain to you what it was. I got to look at everybody's tax returns. No, not really. I didn't do that. But there was something about it that appealed to me. I think it was maybe it was partly the psychology of power, what makes powerful people tick, how do they make decisions, and I was fascinated by that. And so, again, Carolyn Happer schemed with me. I transferred to Duke, thought I was going to study international relations. I even thought about getting a graduate degree at one point in international relations, and I took a lot of courses in Russian, and in fact, I took a course in Russian. I took the politics of the Congo. I studied, I had a course in Indian history. I mean, all this was stirring because I thought it was, my sights were global.
Yeah.
But to get back to answer your question, when it came down to a job, and my second summer in Washington, I mentioned as an intern, the women I worked with at the Capitol all had graduate degrees, law degrees, and they all, to a person, said to me, don't come back to Washington right out of college because women aren't given decent jobs. And I took that to heart. So I came back to Duke my senior year, and I happened to be talking to David Palitz, who I had as a professor, and Alan Kornberg. I had separate conversations with both of them about this. I said, what am I going to do, and what do you think? And I think it was David, I know it was David Palitz who said, did you ever think about covering politics? If you can't get into politics or in government right now, do you ever think about journalism? And I said no, because I'd never written for the school paper. But I immediately started researching this and talking to anybody I could. I applied for a job as an entry-level job. I decided, here's what happened, Cindy. I thought, I haven't had any writing experience. I can't show clips, so I can't get a job in a newspaper. Why don't I try to get a job at a television station? And I thought, I'll just tell them I'll do anything. And so spring break of my senior year, I drove to Atlanta. I picked Atlanta because I figured if I fall flat on my face, I can go crawling home to Augusta and then reconfigure the next step. Interviewed with the 3 news directors at the television stations in Atlanta. It was just the 3 networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC. The only one who really was polite was the news director at the ABC station. He hired me as his secretary to answer the phone, clean the film, empty the trash.
Your switchboard experience.
I was the switchboard experience came in handy. And by the way, as I got up to walk away, and remember, this is after I had been told, don't come to work in Washington because women. He said to me as I'm walking away, besides, how could I not hire somebody with legs like yours?
Oh, well.
So there I was.
Here's what you got, you know?
There I was, this vulnerable, college senior, and I'd like to tell you that I turned her, I whipped around and said, how dare you? But of course I said, oh, thanks. And I sort of slunk out the door and I thought, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself? But I went to work there, cleaned the film, answered the phone, and did whatever I could. After a year, they hired me as the weekend weather girl, so it was Cinderella. During the week, I was the secretary. On the weekends, I did the 11 p.m. Sunday night weather. I hated it. I didn't want to do it, but I did it, and because they said, you have to do this. And all the time, I was lobbying to be a reporter and was hired after a year and a half after Duke to cover the Georgia State Legislature. That was baptism by fire, and that's what really, I think set me on fire when it came to covering politics. I have to say, Indian history and covering the Georgia State Legislature didn't have a lot to do with each other, but it was a true learning experience for me, and that I fell in love with reporting after that and haven't looked back. So that's how it happened.
Fantastic. We'd like to. I know that many of you have questions for Judy or observations about your time at Women's College. I wanted to also extend my thanks to Carolyn Happer. And those of you who've read the program know that that Carolyn is going to be giving tours this afternoon of East Campus. Am I right, Dr. Happer? Is that? No. Anyway, there's a history of Women's College in your packet that you might find interesting. It's a brief history, just dates and key events that I think is really interesting, and I thank her for preparing that for us and for participating today. So let me open the meeting for your questions. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to hear, Judy?
I can call on Louise Dunlap if I could, Louise.
That's great. Do it.
I'm going to put you on the spot because because I'd like for you to share something about your. I mean, Louise has gone on. She's in Washington. She with her husband Joe Browder are two of the most amazing individuals. They've immersed themselves in the environmental. In a number of environmental causes. They are really at the heart of advocating for I think, the most important environmental causes of our time. And I'd like to hear from Louise what it was about the Duke experience that got you doing what you did.
One of the great gifts of youth was that
Right.
even though it was such an early time in the women's movement, I think a lot of us emerged without a sense of barriers in front of us. I mean, just like Judy's story, you just went out and got in there and did it. And it was the self-confidence from this institution that made all of that possible. I went on.
Thank you.
One of the things also that was, at the time we were here, it was very much a Durham and state and regional oriented university, whereas now it's very international, which is
That's true.
very exciting.
That's true.
While still being very rooted in North Carolina. And one of the things that I distinctly remember was, and I can't remember who specifically said it, but it was sort of ingrained in us that we were a very privileged group of people, a privileged institution, and that we owed something back to the region where we were located. And even though I was from Pennsylvania, I ended up shortly after landing, within 2 years of landing in Washington, working to organize a national citizens campaign to regulate strip mining of coal. And it took 6 years, but we got the federal strip mining law passed. But it was very much one of the things that drew me to this particular problem when there were a whole array of problems. Rivers were on fire. I mean, there were problems everywhere. But it was that sense from Duke about doing something about problems in the region that got me involved with coal and still working on it all these years later.
Thanks, Louise. That's great. Gwen.
I'll be here more with this. I think that having Louise speak caused me to want to stand up and say what I think really exemplifies what was good about the Women's College, because I had the privilege of having Louise Dunlap as my FAC.
Ah. I love this.
I was late for curfew one night.
You want to tell us where you were?
Probably in Chapel Hill in the Beta House. But I think that what it exemplifies is to say I happen to be one of the 44 freshmen who got put on the 3rd floor of the Men's Graduate Center my freshman year, which was your senior year, because the yield at the Women's College was so high they didn't have room for us on East Campus.
Oh, that's interesting.
And they
I didn't know that.
handpicked FACs to come to try to help us get into the campus. And I say Louise was my FAC because we kind of dumped, my roommate and I dumped the one we were assigned and became the was to essentially, you talk about anti-Maine where they say open a new window, open a new door. Louise taught us that you could do whatever you wanted to do, and that there were many opportunities out there, all of which we needed to experience. And she encouraged us to take courses from the hardest professors, to venture over to Chapel Hill, to do whatever you needed to do to experience life in the Women's College and do the way that you should do it. I had made a speech not long ago at a bar meeting, and they asked me to talk about mentors and what were mentors. And I thought back and I said, probably the first great mentor I had was Louise Dunlap, who had just an incredible influence on my life. And the ability to have women like the women we've heard speak today is really what it was all about. And so I say these two are why it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. That's a great comment. I just want to comment on that. I am surprised, Judy, by your statement that there were no women professors at this time who were in that role. That's really surprising to me.
Well, there were
in
a
other
few,
fields, no
but,
doubt,
but not
but
in,
yeah.
in my particular. And Scott was here, but I wasn't fortunate enough to be in one of her classes.
Interesting.
I'm sorry? That's right. Yeah.
Please. Go ahead.
I thought I would follow these comments. Karen McCunney, you're from the class of '66, and I was struck, Judy, that you felt that Duke helped you imagine a career, because I think I'm of the generation where Duke told us we were smart, reinforced our power to lead, reinforced our sense of our value as an intellectual hero. But the future beyond Duke was a blank. And so, and I represent a wedge of people where probably 50% married right afterwards. And then the other, which came out when we all came back maybe 20 years later in our lives. Of course, these women that went out to marry became extraordinary leaders in their communities, and some ended up back in the workforce.
Sure,
But not immediately.
sure.
And so my generation, Susie Cunningham was breaking barriers at medical school. My good friend Jane Levine was the first to, was one of 7 women in the University of Chicago Law School of 90. You can imagine what that experience was like. And they did look at her legs, and it was a day of cookies, so you were sharing about her legs. Unfortunately, young women have today very sexualized worlds while they're trying to also find out who they are and be serious. So I think while the Women's College gave us, I would say, the power to invent our lives, and maybe the courage to break down the doors that were still there, to be confronted with the men like you, your first employer, or the person that you met in Capitol Hill, and just sort of put up with it long enough so you could get somewhere else. So that, and I hope that Duke continues to provide for young, and that's why I think, and I had no language to describe what it meant to be a woman. That though we lived it, we didn't talk about it. And this is where the power of women's studies, the power of having language and intellectual concepts to really analyze the lens of gender is critical for young women. And then to do that through race and through sexuality, and all of those markers that really sort our society and determine who gets to do what, are really an important intellectual piece that needs to be a part of every woman's experience and every man's experience who's at Duke today. So I hope that ends up putting those two things together, the lived experience of being a woman, and then the analytical powers to see how that is playing out as women of all kinds across, because then you can identify the things that are really discriminatory and structured racism and structured sexism. So I think Duke is doing that in a much better way than they did with Women's College, but because they merged so much, I feel like you, Judy, that perhaps we've lost some sense for young women of the importance of bonding with each other as women as well as being a wonderful co-education institution.
Judy, excuse me. One of the things you asked me 2 weeks ago was, did I have any role models? And you just heard from Karen McFly. She was on my floor my freshman year, and Karen was one of the 2 people I mentioned here.
So see how it
I
passes
know.
along from Karen to Louise. See how it goes.
Karen, who is your role model?
I have a feeling maybe there was a little slippage between the 1940 era when I graduated, because we were all going out to look for something else. Not all of us, that's for sure. But my closest friends and I, 8 of us, took off for New York City and found our own niches there in whatever field we were in, rather than to get married. We wanted that time to go out and explore. And I'm sorry to say that
There was slippage. It was called the 50s.
the Judy Carlson.
Can you talk a little bit more about the 40s and what was in the world?
Yeah, I'd love to hear that too. What was it like?
Gene O'Barr and people who studied a lot of women's issues will all tell you that just before a war, it seems to have been history that women would be getting ahead, like my mother's generation. She graduated from Wellesley in 1921 or 20, and they were all on the cutting edge, going out and doing things. And then before the Second World War was the same way, and I guess we were part of that generation. Some of us were involved in the war and others were not, but we had seen our counterparts from high school get married, have babies on the way, when unfortunately their husband was killed overseas. And we were not going to let ourselves get in that position. We wanted to go out and have a career we could come back to.
That's interesting.
And in the meantime, got married.
This is my big memory. What you did when you arrived at Duke, your freshman week, was to join the Y. Everybody did it. You gave them $10, and then you remember the Y. And I can't remember what we ever did as members of the Y, but everybody joined. And so there was a girl who said, "Why should I join the Y?" And everybody said, "Because you joined the Y." And she said, "Well, I'm not going to do it." We were appalled. How could she not join the Y? Everybody joins the Y. That was our nice girls in the 50s. And I remember we went off to the beach once for a weekend, and Mary Grace Wilson brought us in first. We talked about Mary Grace Wilson, and she said, "Remember who you are and what you represent." So we went off and we behaved ourselves. As Mary Grace told us we had to. And then the final thing I remember is the question was, what were the rules that we lived under, that we chafed under as students? And I don't know how many of you were at a time when the first 6 weeks of school, you were not to speak to a male after 7 o'clock. Because I guess girls had gone out on dates. And so they said, "Oh, no, I wasn't a date." Well, if you can't speak to a boy, then obviously you can't go to the state. I was taking music appreciation, and we had to go out to that building out there, I don't know if it's still there, where you listen to music, the music that you have to learn. And I went out there, and there was another student who was a male, and he, after we listened to the music, I don't think we talked. And then we had to walk from that building way out there to the bus stop, and I live at Jarvis, but the Jarvis, so here we are walking all along, and we fall. And so I turned myself in.
Oh my goodness! The 50s, you gotta love it. You gotta love it.
I've got to remember this story.
Well, thank you for that. And I think it's just been wonderful for me, particularly the way that each of you has told a story that has in some sense exemplified your time period. And so it's great to see those generational stories coming forth, and I hope we can continue this conversation as the morning goes forward. We began, Dottie, with the 40s. That was our earliest moment of recollection, and it makes me again regret this morning the absence of Mary Siemens, who could so ably have talked about the 30s. And I just want to call your attention to this DVD that's in each of your packets, and some lovely words by Mary on the DVD about her experiences with Women's College. So with that, let's take a short break and come back in 5 minutes or so for our next panel. Thank you.
Right. And thank you, Judy.